Welcome to the SSI Orbit Podcast, a forum where we explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. In today's conversation, I welcome Kaliya Young, often referred to as Identity Woman, for a sneak peek on what to expect from IIW 32, the 32nd iteration of the Internet Identity Workshop, which will be hosted virtually. So for over 15 years, IIW has been the premier place to bring together the largest concentration of talents dedicated to designing and building identity systems that empower individuals. So this episode is meant to give a high-level overview of the topics that are being discussed in the digital and decentralized identity communities in preparation for this event. Now, listeners of this podcast who haven't registered yet for IIW or maybe are on the fence about registering can get a 20% discount by using the discount code in the show notes. So we look forward to seeing you all there, and without further ado, here's my conversation with Kaliya Young. Okay, we're live. Kaliya, how is it going?
It's great.
Great. What's keeping you busy these days?
Well, I am the ecosystems director at the COVID-19 Credentials Initiative. So that's my current main focus of work. And in that role, I've been tapped to co-chair the interoperability working group for Good Health Pass that is happening in the Trust Over IP Foundation.
Awesome. Been following both of those projects, the CCI for, I think it's been over a year now already.
It's a year, yep.
And then the Good Health Pass, definitely seeing a lot of momentum and excitement behind that project. So I would like to go a little deeper into both of those as we go through the conversation here today. I read, this is a quote from, I pulled online. So you go as Identity Woman, and Identity Woman is a NIM warrior. And,
yeah.
What is a NIM warrior?
So this term emerged around when Google created Google Plus, building on top of its email system, basically. It's created profiles for people who had email addresses, and then early on you could get like invited into the Google Plus social network. And those early invitations went out and they spread around, and then at some point they were going to like flip over to be like totally public so anybody could join once they kind of had a critical mass. And it was at that point that Google decided to implement effectively a real names policy, and it started canceling or suspending people's accounts who didn't have what we started to term WASPO-NIMs. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant names. So if you were John Smith, you were fine, even if that wasn't your real name, because it looked like a real name to the algorithms. But me, Kaliya Identity Woman, which is, my first name in real life plus my online handle, was suspended because it didn't look like a real name. And this is, they're building a social network of people who are online, many of whom who've used handles in the online space for a decade or more. And you're like, well, that's not real, except it is real because they use it online and have done for 10 years. So stop canceling people because they don't match your naming algorithm, which only lets certain types of names through. So there was, it became like there's a hashtag. I'm sure if you searched on it today, we'll all get like the NIM wars. And so like people started finding each other on Twitter and being like, what's going on? And like there was a really big fight at the time with Google around this. And folks like Tim O'Reilly got into the fray and started to saying there's a lynch mob against Google. I'm like, time out, Tim. That's not an appropriate term for people who are marginalized, who have different identities, telling a big corporation that they're wrong, when lynching was what happened to Black people in the South by white mobs. Like, these are not equivalent, and you can't make this. And in fact, I even pointed at the example from Roots where Kunta Kinte was like, my name is Kunta Kinte. And like the slave owner is like, no, your name's Toby, right? And it's sort of, it's not the same at all in a kind of, slavery, and that impact is much greater than these smaller fights we're having about naming, but it's the entity with more power saying to the other people, no, your name can't be Identity Woman or Rainbow Starflower or whatever that sort of funny internet handle you had. That's not real, right? And it was talking more about this power imbalance about who has the right to name themselves and who gets to say what a legitimate name is.
Yeah, and there's something extremely powerful about pseudonymity too. That it's one of the things I love on Twitter today too. Is you have these people with such powerful voices that I don't know what their legal name is, and I actually don't care either, right? And
right.
it's like your legal name is kind of I don't know if it's an antiquated attribute for identifying you, but I mean on certain things, and like Google Plus is probably one of them. Like, why can't you be called what you want to be called? What's the difference?
Right. And they kind of came back and said, well, behavior, blah, blah. And all the community managers are like, manage behavior in communities. That isn't managed by what you choose to call yourself. And it's really, names are tools that people use to communicate about each other. And what happens to be on our administrative paperwork and where it's appropriate to force people to share the name that's on their administrative paperwork is something we need to be talking about, because it's not always relevant, and in fact can be harmful and make vulnerable people more vulnerable if they are required to share that.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think from the other perspective, you're talking about like being canceled because you're not providing a name, but people get canceled because they provide their names.
Yeah.
From the other side around, right? And so it's an interesting kind of social landscape that's been developing on the internet. And so you've been in the digital ID space. I know you started IIW in 2005. How, this is kind of a broad question, but like from when you got into the space to where we are now, how have you seen the different trends move, or what's really changed?
Well, both a lot. And then I think, my core inspiration and the place I got started on the path of looking at digital identity was a community called Planet Work, which is planet and network mushed together. And they, as a community, did some discernment after their 2000 the year 2000 conference that they hosted, and asked what was a missing piece of infrastructure needed to make the internet better for people and for people to self-organize, to connect to each other, to make the planet and the ecosystem and the earth that we live on better. And it was a very interesting answer that they came up with. They identified a gap and said there are no open standards for digital identity, for the representation of people in the digital realm, and that we needed open standards for this. And that if we didn't take the time to invest in creating those open standards, that if you sort of took the current trajectory without those open standards forward, you would end up with governments and large corporations owning everybody's identity. And they were right? So they took the paper that they wrote, the Augmented Social Network white paper, Building Identity and Trust into the Next Generation, shopped it around to a bunch of foundations and who didn't understand what they were talking about, didn't understand the missing infrastructure piece they were naming, and didn't understand the implications of not funding its development at the time. And here we are. Facebook kind of owns everybody's digital representation of themselves, with like bonus Google owns a bunch of them too. And now we have sort of OpenID Connect, and it's sort of NASCAR with like login with these different options, but none of them are you. So I mean, I think the good thing is this, and to be fair, OpenID and OAuth all were developed within the context of IIW, and they were better than everybody going to a new website and getting an entirely different identity every time. I think that there was corporate capture that happened with those standards, and I think people are very concerned about this with this next generation of open standards, and are really pushing even harder for them to be open and person driven, and hopefully we can have truly open standards that have less corporate capture than the first generations. But I'm really optimistic about, getting usable PKI into the hands of normal people on apps they control on their devices. That's super exciting. And I think has the potential to fulfill those original visions that I got inspired by in the first place. So this keeps me, motivated to help these new technologies to succeed, because I think they realize key aspects of that original vision that have yet to be realized.
I definitely think the rise of mobile and stuff like that has given tools in people's pockets to be able to manage their own identity attributes or all sorts of credentials. I do find it interesting, I guess, like when you had started IIW in 2005, I'm trying to think back to when I opened my Facebook account. I think it was maybe a couple of years before that or around that time too. So I guess Facebook hadn't, like the
Facebook
internet
wasn't founded until 2004. I mean, and sometimes I describe myself as like being against Facebook before it ever existed, in the sense that we were naming this issue and being like.
And it is funny today, like a lot of people have been talking about the security breach that they had. Who knows when it happened, but they talked about it like a week ago or so, of all these accounts that have been breached. Out of 196 million users, they dropped down to 194 million users, with an increase in traffic in the time too. So it's it's crazy to see kind of the risks that go with the models that they have in place today. But it's just I think we're seeing some really good movements in the communities we're in, but the people that are using these Web 2 or however we want to call it kind of systems, it's just they don't seem to be impacted by this stuff.
Sure. And until we have better tools, they won't be, because they're pragmatic, right? I think we need to take this sort of seedling infrastructure we have and grow it up so it actually provides better value to a whole range of actors who today find value in a Facebook ecosystem. And part of that is around entrepreneurs building alternative social networks who are committed to interoperability and to really putting users in control in a way that Facebook has not. A great example is the work that Jim Fournier is doing with a network called True.net. And that uses uses decentralized identifier in the infrastructure, and also a standard that they're putting forward for adoption by others called JLink, that allows you to see the provenance of information that you're viewing in your social network. And they're committed to working with other emerging sort of alternative social network operators to have interoperability between their platform and other people's platforms.
That's awesome. And it looks like there's two different types of ways to approach decentralized identity. Like you could build new platforms and compete with the existing platforms that are out there, but there's also the existing platforms out there could start re-architecting themselves a little bit to be able to meet the privacy and consent driven properties that people are looking for and should have access to. The digital ID space is absolutely booming. Like if you talk about just like these ID proofing companies on one side, just all these verticals, right? I got my ID proofing companies, I got my e-signature companies. I could even get into the cyberspace, and I'm talking a lot about identity and access management companies that have been involved in IIW for all these years. How do you see them kind of going towards that space? It's one thing to build kind of a new platform from scratch, but what's your view on how these existing, for lack of a better word, centralized providers are approaching this?
Yeah, I mean, look, those entities are solving business problems businesses have, right? And the question is, can we solve those business problems with open standards that make it easier for someone to take a verifiable credential from one party and share it with another and have them believe it, right? I think in the end, if we're successful with a bunch of these new emerging open standards, they're very disruptive to the existing business models of identity proofers, et cetera, because they're making money over the fact that the sort of current paper-based model of document provision means that the only way to figure out whether something is true is to go and ping large data sets that they have access to and are corralling and then making, assertions based on those data sets that other businesses are relying on. I think, this is another underreported property of the kind of verifiable credentials technology that is being developed at IIW, is that if we are successful, we end the "if I know information about you, I can be you" problem, because the only way you can be you is if you actually have the verifiable credential from an authoritative source, which I'm sure we will have attacks that try and get those, but that's different than the current attack model, which is I'm going to find information about you, and because I know that information, I'm going to commit fraud or try and steal things from you because I'm convincing someone I am you because I know information about you. And that whole set of attack surfaces goes away when you have verifiable credentials type infrastructure, where only the person who was issued a credential can assert those things about themselves, because they can know information about you, but they can't replay you presenting the credential because only you have it.
I was on the phone with someone earlier today that was calling me just to ask, like, his email was taken over basically, and his email is connected to a whole lot of his different accounts, right? His banking account, his crypto account, all sorts of things. And the person was able to get in and change his recovery email, and he's been kind of stuck in this whole thing. So you have all of these types of issues like you just described that are able to happen in I guess it's
that problem. So, like, to be fair, people should be using two-factor authentication, FIDO tokens, etc., right? So there's, I do think, though, if we move towards verifiable credentials and sort of that kind of tooling for authentication, it's also way more secure. That's why I knew we were onto something, is once the banks started showing up and go, that's really cool. That usable PKI you're embedding in the app is way better than little owls looking back at you and like SMTP messages. Let's do that. And I was like, yay, the banks are into this because of security properties, not because it's good for people. And maybe we'll get both, right? We'll get good for people and more secure for the banks, which is sort of the win-win we want to actually get broad market adoption.
Yeah, and I guess like these processes of authentication, like 2FA, this type of thing, these are still very good processes. It's just you could do them using verifiable credentials, rather than using a one-time PIN or just and these other methods that having worked for a bank before, that's what we did, right? So you get an email with a code or a text message with a code, and to be honest, I probably get these every day now with different services I use. So something like verifiable credentials for like a two-factor authentication could be something interesting, which I'm not sure if that's what Microsoft is going to do with their Authenticator app or whatever, but it is interesting to see companies like Microsoft, who are obviously not new to the space, but they're making significant headway with verifiable credentials.
Yeah.
So IIW is coming up next week.
It is next week.
Are we a week away from it? We're recording this Monday.
Tomorrow. Yeah.
So
a week away. It starts on Tuesday.
So you must be excited about it. You must be overwhelmed with work right now. What is it looking like this year? I attended I'm fairly, well, much newer to the space than someone like yourself or a lot of other people that are in there. I attended, I think, the past two IIWs, so it's quite new to me still. The first time I attended IIW, I just couldn't believe like the brilliance that's in there, and I absolutely loved the format. That it's just, you're not stuck to just listen to people or to a certain agenda. You could just move around and try to progress as you want. So I think the this unconference, or however you label it as, format for IIW is phenomenal. But what are you the most looking forward to for this year's IIW?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were really fortunate with the pandemic kicking in last year that we had a pathway to go virtual. My friend Lucas Chaffee had a platform he built specifically to do several different formats, but one of the formats he had in mind when he designed Kiko Chat was open space technology, which is what we use to co-create the agenda live the morning of the event. So to sort of know where to go once, we had 6 weeks from when we officially decided to go virtual to be virtual, we were able to use Lucas's platform to recreate what happens live and in person. So if you haven't been to IIW in person, we sit in a circle. We sit 250 people in a circle together, and we articulate the principles of open space and the law of motion and responsibility, which says, if you aren't learning or contributing in your session, it's your responsibility to respectfully get up and go to somewhere that you are. And that works in person, and we took that same format that we use in person and translated it online pretty seamlessly. The great thing about that, after that first virtual version, is people came to us and said, everything is so crazy with the pandemic, but IIW was exactly the same, and I needed that. And I was like, great.
I definitely second that thought. Yeah.
So we're really lucky that we got to translate it into the digital version and continue the vibrancy and dynamics, and even expand it, because there were people able to come to virtual IIW who were unable to make it to our physical version in Mountain View. And we're planning to go back to the physical version in the fall, hopefully, and then to alternate between a digital and a in-person to capture some of the good things about being virtual that we've liked, but also to reconnect our community with the affordances that an in-person meeting provides that you just can't recreate digitally.
And I guess in the spirit of inclusivity, it was great to see just how people from all over are able to actually participate and see that. And I think you and the other organizers do a really good job of making it inclusive, so people of different statures could join for sure. What are, I guess, going in now that we're a week or close to being a week out from IIW 32? What are the biggest industry trends that you're seeing that people are excited to discuss in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have a big discussion about COVID-19 credentials. I mean, they've sort of only grown in importance since they were a seedling of conversation at the beginning of the pandemic. A year ago, BBS Plus was put forward as a new credential signing format, specifically JSON LD ZKP with BBS Plus. And that has really grown in terms of people's understanding of how good it could be, and a lot of alignment in the industry is happening around it. And I published a paper, which we can put in the show notes, in January, articulating the choice landscape and the different flavors of verifiable credentials, and why this new format helped meet a lot of different criteria that different subgroups in the community had. And sort of encouraged more alignment with it so we can get real interoperability. Like, writing a standard isn't enough to build an ecosystem of interoperability. There's this critical step of like implementing the standard and seeing if your version of what you implemented works in software created by other people also conforming with the standard. And I think that's also going to be a big topic this year in terms of what's next in terms of testing, growing the pie of the systems that work well with each other. And in the process, building the market for all the entrepreneurs building on the standard, right? To me, every new client of every company in the ecosystem is a good thing for everyone else.
Is this BBS plus these methods? These must be exciting to the COVID-19 types of projects, right? It seems like they're the ones really spearheading a lot of the interoperability conversations.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I don't want to get into all the politics that are trying to sort themselves out behind the scenes. I think we're all really doing our best, and I think there is a goodwill effort by everybody trying to solve for COVID use cases to get to interoperability. And there's still some clear, distinct differences out there, and we're continuing to dialogue, right?
Have you seen lots of discussions happening or looking like they're going to happen around governance? Just I know that's a very broad topic, but
what do you mean by governance?
Yeah, well, I guess good question back to me. I guess I come from the perspective from an ecosystem solutions implementation across the stack, just being able, and I refer just back to the trust over IP stack on this one, just across the stack of having registry of DIDs and credential schemas and stuff like that, the peer-to-peer communications, the credentialing exchange, the ecosystem rules and governance. Have you seen a lot of advancement in that? So over the past years, or is this something that you see conversations around or are hoping to see at the next IIW?
I would hope that the people who are so gung-ho at Trust over IP make space to listen to people who have chosen to opt out and not participate in that ecosystem, because there's reasons people are doing that, right? I think I'm really hopeful that the kind of momentum around the JSON-LD ZKP with BBS Plus can grow to the extent that we aren't having these that we aren't having a conversation about my flavor of credential versus your flavor versus another. Like, it's kind of exhausting. It's hurting. It has hurt market adoption. I think that one of the things I've come to understand, and this is also like a kind of natural split within the community, one split that sort of continues but won't ever go away, is the difference between permission ledgers and public ledgers in terms of where to anchor decentralized identifiers. People just have different philosophical sort of anchors of which one to choose. And I think they both have valid points. So we're never not going to see people anchor DIDs on public chains, and we're never not going to see another set of people choose to anchor on permission ledgers for their own business process reasons. One of them being like large corporations being completely freaked out that they could be hosting a node that somebody happened to put some PII in some entry in a ledger 3 years ago, and now they're liable under GDPR. So like, forget it. We're controlling the whole chain, which is fine. In terms of like them meeting their business use cases and needs. So that's one like piece of a governance conversation that is there and won't go away. I think there's another piece of governance, which is surfacing existing systems and business processes that people are needing to name and articulate more clearly. So if you look at something like the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, it's done an amazing job of kind of surfacing the processes involved in creating identity documentation for both businesses and people in the first place. sort of forcing a detailed examination of the business process steps that go into creating that, and then getting it all clear and going like, and which ones do you have, right? So it's not so much like creating quote unquote new governance, but sort of surfacing systems and processes that were perhaps taken for granted and making it more explicit what's happening so that apples and apples and oranges can get compared to each other. So like, how is the identity business process of how British Columbia creates citizen ID cards compare with how the province of Quebec does it? And if they're similar enough, then Quebec can trust BC's credentials and BC can trust Quebec's, right? Like, and I think that that's probably a good thing to be surfacing and having conversations about what the meaning of different credentials are and how the creation of those assertions is done in ways that other entities can have confidence in them.
Yeah, I like the reference to the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which we are familiar with being here in Canada. I think the work that Joni has pushed forward through the DIAC, both on the public and private sector, and really finding a good way to componentize the different atomic processes, or however you want to call it, because like you said, it's not a one mold fits all type of thing either, right? It's just if you're aligned on the principles and certain elements underneath there, then that's a way that you'll definitely be able to trust credentials coming between different ecosystems, whatever they are. So really good stuff coming out of there. And to your ledger comment, and I think we've seen a lot of momentum with the non-ledger type of stuff
That's
as
true.
well, right?
Yeah.
So you have the permission ledgers, you have the public ledgers. It's been interesting to see advancements on both those sides. And it seems like the key event receipt infrastructure project, however you call it, is gaining a lot of momentum too, and people seem quite interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked a bit about the private sector. What are you seeing, I guess, from a self-sovereign identity or decentralized identity perspective? Is there a lot of public sector or government involvement in IIW, just for folks to know if they're looking to have these types of conversations?
Yeah, but there could be more. I mean, there's sort of the usual suspects, right? There's the British Columbia guys, Timbuma. And I'm like, who else shows up that's from government?
There's some interesting work in the States that you know very well with the DHS too. I'm sure a lot of the stuff.
Oh yeah, and Neil and his crew. Yeah, I mean, but those are folks. I mean, all of those folks have been in the community for years now, right? So I like, and I know companies all around the world who have been talking to their own governments. Whether those government folks actually show up at IW, I don't know. I think my understanding is that there are government fora focused on digitization and digital transformation, where I think there are conversations happening that we just don't hear about in the private sector because they feel more comfortable talking to themselves. And hopefully over time, more of those conversations will come out into more accessible fora.
I'm sure, like we mentioned before too, there seems to be, well, and there is clearly a lot of conversation around the health credentials. Do you mind kind of giving an overview from your point of view, what has happened with the Good Health Pass initiative? From my point of view, just from my perception, having not been involved, as we're not too involved in health credentials, it's a project that started under ID 2020 and developed a relationship with Trust over IP to execute some stuff. Do you mind just lighting or putting a bit of clarity behind that?
So I don't know. I mean, that's as best as your description is as good as mine in terms of those details. I think that one of the inspirations for it was to catalyze a global conversations around critical stakeholders in international travel, specifically around test results and sharing those. because the World Health Organization only has a mandate to address vaccine credentials under international regulations, and basically said straight out, we aren't dealing with testing. Okay, great. So given that countries are mandating testing to get in, somebody has to deal with it. And those entities who make international travel go needed to collaborate together to figure out how there was sort of one or a much narrower set, maybe not one, but a common way to figure out how to get a test from a trusted lab and share it into a traveler decision system, and to support governments on the other end being able to see those results, right? And that's a lot of entities that were really clear they didn't want to see a global system with 40 different apps, with 40 different testing lab networks that might require a person with 3 flights in a day to go get 3 different tests from 3 different labs with 3 different apps. That isn't going to help global travel reopen. It's going to keep it closed. So there's a lot of moving pieces in trying to solve the legitimate business need to figure out if countries are requiring test results to get in, and airplanes are sort of required to get that proof before they let someone on a plane to go to country X, how is that going to happen in a way that's as privacy preserving as possible, empowering to the individual as possible, and reduced headache in terms of processing and managing that information in those existing systems?
Which is the same thing, I guess, for there's some governments that are mandating it. There's some announcements. At least the U.S. federal government announced that they weren't going to mandate a digital wallet or digital credentials, and some states are not doing it. But I guess regardless of that, whoever the relying parties are in these transactions,
they're verifiers. They're not relying parties.
What? How do you
I'm teasing you.
Okay.
I mean, it's really important that we call them verifiers and not. I mean, yes, they're relying parties, but part of like these language is really important. Like a relying party is phoning home to an identity provider, and these systems don't do that. Right. And
I thought they were interchangeable, and just coming from the space where banks talking about this stuff and just figuring that the issuer holder verifier model was just us saying verifier is relying party. But okay, I see the difference that you're pointing out.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You obviously build communities. You build communities through CCI. You built communities in the identity space for many years now. Having done all of this, and like we talked about inclusivity a little bit before too, and when we talk about adoption, it's just thinking more and more about the role that culture plays into to this stuff. And a silly example would just be just an American culture versus a Chinese culture, how different they are, right? What role does culture play in the adoption of this on a global scale?
Different cultures make different assumptions and agreements about how they operate. I think one of the appealing things about the underlying architectural affordances of decentralized identity and verifiable credentials is it matches how it aligns with core values and current architectural realities of how identity systems work within Western liberal democracies. And so when I talk to government leaders who are active in this space, they're like, look, I'm Canadian. I was born in British Columbia. The province of British Columbia is the authoritative source of my birth date because they were the administrative region where I was born. My parents filed the paper with them, work with them, and they have that on file, right? That government wants to help me get that information in a form I can reuse and share with other people. But they don't want to be in the middle of every transaction I do forever where I share my birth date. They're like, it's none of my business. I don't want to know. So don't build a system where you put me in the loop, which is different than an architectural choice that was made in India with the development of their Aadhaar system, where with the fundamental underlying architectural design as originally conceived, every time you presented your Aadhaar number, and by extension, the core demographic information within it, your name and your birthday, the government would see it because it is a phone home authentication system, meaning you ping the government to do the authentication to see if the person standing in front of you is the person they claim to be, having this particular number. And, we have identifier systems in the West for social service provision. They're called social security numbers in the US, social insurance numbers in Canada. They have all sorts of different names, I'm sure, in Europe. They're kind of the same. They're this number that you use to interact with the government, to pay your taxes, to receive pension benefits, to receive disability pension benefits, and potentially other things. But they're a long-lived indexical number connected to your real name so that they can figure out it's you again. But there's right now, at least, in Canada and the United States, there's no way to do authentication against that number because it's not a network endpoint, and they don't want it to be. So part of the reason for innovating these decentralized identity systems and why Western liberal democracies are interested in them is because they support people being able to prove those things about themselves without the government being in the loop all the time. And they don't want to be in the loop.
Well, Kaliya, I guess just as a last question here, or just a last thought, what would you tell people who are still on the fence of attending IIW that haven't attended it before?
Well, I enthusiastically invite you. IIW does cost money to attend. And if that is a barrier to you being able to participate, please reach out to us. We are really committed to accessibility. We also have rates that are for students, folks who are with startups in the developing world, etc. But we are, we charge money because it costs us money to put on the event. Even the virtual event, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of the labor involved in creating the space and collecting all the notes and doing all of the space creation and holding. But it's really, it's a little bit of the deep end, right? In the sense of, you're in the rooms with the people who invented this technology in the first place, but that's a really great thing too. So, I'd encourage folks who want to explore the space to come. There's other options too, right? You can subscribe to my newsletter. Every week I publish the Identisphere with InfoMiner. We sort through all of the blogosphere and Twittersphere news and highlight the best of what happened out this week in the industry. There's a ton of webinars and podcasts and online resources. And it's a really friendly community too, meaning if you have questions and you're confused, you can host a session about your confusion and people will come and help you, right? So in unconference means several things. One, the agenda isn't created until the day of the event, but also other formats besides presentation are invited and encouraged, including people who are lost and confused asking questions.
Well, we'll include the registration kind of links in the show notes with Kaliya's kind of contact information through social as well. And I will say your Identisphere newsletter is just an amazing resource every week. So if people aren't on that, I try to keep up with speed with stuff that's happening. I don't know what you do to keep up with all these different things that are happening, but just for kind of a one-stop shop to get overwhelmed every week with everything that's happening, it's the best thing to be subscribed to. So I'll link that in the show notes as well. Kaliya, thank you so much for doing this with me today. I very much look forward to IIW.
Thank you so much for having me. And please reach out to me if you want to get connected to the community. I'm really happy to help you find your niche amongst all of us.
Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episode releases, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever channel you're listening to it right now. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me directly. You can find me online. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I look forward to hearing from you. See you all next time.